Some of the companies will be on what we're talking about. The latest ranking of the top 500 companies in Africa reveals that the large companies across energy, mining, telecoms, airlines, and other sectors are facing macroeconomic turbulence due to a number of headwinds. Let's dig into that report as we bring on Kanika Segal. Kanika is the business editor of the Africa Report magazine that released the ranking report a few days ago. Great to see you again, madam. We thank you for connecting here on the show tonight.
Hi, Bowson. It's good to be back.
It's good to see you first time in the new year. Thank you so much. Give me an overview of this top 500 African companies report and the research work that went into that report.
So I think this is our 26th or 27th iteration of the top 500 corporates. And, we're lucky that we have really good, well-established relationships with a lot of the corporates across the continent in the public and the private sector. So over the years, we've been able to gather so much more information around how companies are growing. So as you can see, I think from the list, the ranking, we have 500 there. And some of them are private and some of them are public companies. And because we have such good relationships with them, we're able to access a lot more information to help us create, this very rich database of information of how big African companies are.
Broadly speaking, what are some of the key challenges that these companies face during the review period? As you asked, about 1,300 companies were reviewed. So that's quite a whole lot that your team does this work from Paris to a number of countries in Africa, including Kenya, where you are.
Yeah. So I think for the businesses in our ranking this year, and that is for the accounting period of 2023-24, which is also staggered because a lot of the countries has different regulations. So to try and make it comparable, we try and align how we look at some of their reporting. But I think two of the biggest issues that corporates faced was currency devaluations and also the impact of the macroeconomic environment. So I think if we look at Nigeria, for instance, it's a really interesting case to look at some of the Nigerian corporates in our list. So while state-owned enterprises across the board, so across the continent, dominate the rankings in terms of revenue generation, in Nigeria, it's actually the other way around. So there are only, out of 34 Nigerian companies listed in the top 500, only 2 of them are state-owned enterprises, and that's the NNPC and Nigeria LNG. So it just shows how kind of strong the private sector is in Nigeria for a start. The second point to make there, though, with Nigeria is obviously there's been huge currency devaluations within that period of reporting. So when you look at kind of the dollar revenue change within Nigeria, that growth is actually limited to around 8%. But if you look at it in Naira terms, it's actually up by around, I think it's something around 60%. So you can see the vast difference in that and how important it is to have some of the report writing that we have that goes along with the ranking to understand and digest some of these results. So it's a really interesting case for Nigeria, the impact that the local currency devaluation has had on revenue growth in dollars and in Naira and how that's reflected in our rankings.
Yeah, very, very interesting. When you look at the energy company and the energy sector, you talk about the NNPC in Nigeria, you talk about Sonatrach and a few others outside Nigeria. What are you seeing in countries such as, what do you see the report reveal in countries such as Egypt, for example, where you've seen have currency issues as well as some macroeconomic headwinds?
Yeah, so Egypt it's not the same, obviously, but there is a similar story to be told in terms of how the currency devaluation has impacted revenue for the largest corporates. So I think there were around 45 Egyptian companies in the ranking in total. And if you look at them, if you look at the revenue of all of them combined, the dollar-denominated revenue for the Egyptian companies fell by around 19-20%. But when you look at it again in local currency, it fell a much slower rate, around 1%. And I think if you take into account again some of the macroeconomic headwinds, as you mentioned, and some of the other, like the currency devaluation, that kind of makes up, that really accounts for what we've seen in the numbers.
Interesting. Let's move a little bit into the mining sector. Your report reveals some headwinds for companies in the mining sector, especially those operating in South Africa. Where is that so? Kanika?
So I think if you look at what happened again in 2023, 2024, there was a fall in certain commodity prices. So the price of platinum fell, palladium, I think even oil and gas prices fell as well. And that really reflected in some of the South African mining companies. So while, again, they're still quite high in the rankings, let's not forget, let's not ignore that, but they have fallen slightly, a few places as well. So if we look at the ranking again in a little bit more depth, I think it's Sibanye-Stillwater, for instance, fell a few spots. I think Kroondal as well, another mining company, lost some revenue, and Thungela Resources, Anglo American, they've all kind of fallen a few spots in our ranking. So yes, I think that's largely to do with the fall in the commodity prices.
But your report also revealed that despite these macroeconomic headwinds, or what you call, yes, those headwinds, there's still, some of these sectors in Africa are still pulling their weight. What did this report therefore broadly reveal about doing business in Africa?
So I think what it's just showing is the diversification that we're seeing across the board in terms of how companies are developing. So when you go back to even just 3-4 years ago, South African companies dominated the rankings. And part of that was to do with accessibility of reporting and actually the size of the companies. But what you're seeing now is that, the Nigerian companies, the Moroccan companies, the Egyptian companies are all rising up the ranks because they're growing very strongly. And that is what we're seeing in the rankings. I think we definitely see that the mining companies, the oil and gas companies continue to dominate. And I think and that's led by some of Africa's major exporters that are able to leverage their natural wealth and export and earn in dollars. So that's always going to have an impact on the revenue in dollars, which is what we measure. But I do think, yes, if you look at our ranking year on year, the most interesting thing is, you're seeing a greater share of revenue going to the Nigerian corporates versus the South African corporates, even though they still dominate. And I think it'll be really interesting to see next year and the year after how that shifts again.
All right, let's sum it up outside the commodities, energy and mining, telecommunications and airlines business. I didn't miss that in that report about Ethiopian Airlines, for example. The comeback of Kenya Airways, Rwanda Air, and a few Royal Air Mahawk, and even South Africa is trying to fly its way out of turbulence.
Yeah, so I think what you've seen is, again, this is all part of the diversification story. So you're seeing a lot more airline companies in our rankings than before. They've obviously been restructuring and focusing on the growth strategy over the last few years. So it's been interesting, again, to see that reflected in our rankings. I think what would be, again, something to look at, I think you mentioned telecoms there. Again, we have seen reflected in our rankings what happened with MTN, for instance, huge revenue losses in dollar terms, but actually when you look at it in Naira, the company has done a lot better than expected. So again, I think this is all about understanding the regional dynamics within this ranking, which countries has seen, policies, policy reform, economic policy reform, for instance, which has seen their currency devalued or depreciating, and to really be able to use that to reflect what we see in the rankings.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you so much for giving us more facts into and insight to those top 500 companies latest ranking report. Thank you very much. Great job.